Um, okay, I'm Aparna Bomzai-Dodson. I am currently the track co-lead for social and behavioral sciences in AGU's Science and Society section. I'm joined by Kripa Jagannathan, who is my track co-lead for now and who's president-elect of the section. Just a reminder, as you might have seen, that this webinar is being recorded. By default, everyone is muted. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we are tracking what is being asked in the chat. So I did want to share a little bit about who we are for those of you who may be new to AGU and our section. So in 2020, AGU released a new strategic plan that focused on both discovery and solutions science. And as a result, AGU has a number of different sections. There used to be a section called Public Affairs, and it became Science and Society. So this intersection of how you take discovery-based science and transfer it into solutions. The section broadly works to support and grow a community to facilitate stronger connections between societies and earth and space sciences, and to foster innovations within AGU that better enable discoveries and solutions in the geosciences to benefit humanity. Within our section, there are 5 tracks: art and science, science policy, community and citizen science, science communication, and then the one that we're here with today, the social and behavioral sciences track. The social and behavioral sciences track is specifically focused on including information about how people and institutions think, feel, and behave with respect to scientific knowledge. And we're trying to reach out to disciplines that may not traditionally have been very active in the American Geophysical Union, which include things like anthropology and economics and history. And we're trying to also include knowledge systems from non-academic communities in order to forge this link between science and society. We're also trying to highlight practice-based knowledge development, so not just the traditional research model. So we would love for those of you on the call, if what you're hearing from us resonates with you and what you hear from our speakers today resonates with you, please connect with our section and get involved. This is the last of a dialogue series that highlighted each of the different tracks. We also are very active at the annual AGU fall meeting. This year it will be in Chicago in just a few weeks. And you can get on our website and check out the recordings of prior dialogues and other ways to engage with us. Our particular track, the social and behavioral sciences, will have both an online and in-person poster session at the AGU meeting. We will also have an oral hybrid session on Thursday with 2 invited speakers, one of whom is Dr. Raja, who you'll hear from today in a flash talk. Additionally, the Science and Society section hands out an award every year. This is the first team-based award for AGU. And so if you're interested in learning more about how to nominate someone for the award or a team for the award, please let us know. Our first recipient of this award was the Unlearning Racism in Geoscience Initiative. And we're really happy to be able to offer this as a service to the community. Today, we're going to showcase 4 experts who are really on the cutting edge of integrating social and behavioral science perspectives into the geosciences. And so we're really excited to bring these voices to you. We have a longer keynote today from Dr. Tamara Wall, who's a research professor at the Desert Research Institute and deputy director of the Western Regional Climate Center. Tamara is a pioneer in helping build institutions that bring together social and physical scientists to work towards a common goal. We also have some shorter flash talks. The first will be by Miguel Onezorge, who is a doctoral student at the University of Cambridge and a visiting fellow at Boston University. He brings in a history lens to geosciences, and his work is on the history of modeling and measurement in the earth and planetary sciences. Second will be Dr. Uroj Raja, who is an assistant professor of environmental advocacy and social change at Loyola University, and brings in a social psychology perspective. Her work evaluates old and new ways of communicating about social issues. And the third is Dr. Tushara Gunda, who is a principal member of technical staff at Sandia National Labs. She's an engineer and data scientist who blends a variety of social science perspectives and approaches in her work to address really complex environmental challenges. And thank you, Kripa. She has put longer bios into the chat for folks who would like to follow up with our speakers. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Tamara to kick us off.
All right, I will go ahead and share screen. It works. All right, are we good? Awesome. All right, well, good morning, everyone, and or afternoon, depending on where in the world or the continent you are. Thank you for having me here today. This is a fun talk for me, so I think I hope that some of these reflections will be helpful for people. And what I wanted to focus on is actually how I am not I'm not a very good academic researcher. I tend to have my background is a little different, and I come at things from a slightly different angle. And I just wanted to talk about how that has been helpful to me in my career, and also thinking about how to do research to action, which my focus is really on not so much the traditional kind of academic outputs, of peer-reviewed papers and conference proceedings, but is more focused on how, as we like to put it, getting stuff done and actually working with practitioners really directly to understand how research results can really inform the decision-making process. So as I kind of alluded to, I've had a little bit of a non-linear path to academia. After I finished I did a bachelor's degree in English Lit because that's what I was really good at. So it made sense for me to do that when I was like 19. And then I did a master's degree in technical and professional communication, but I discovered really quickly that working on writing computer manuals, which is what tech writers did back in the early 90s, was really like horrifyingly boring, and I wanted to like fall off my chair and die every day. So I ran away to the woods, and I had a really, really fun decade running around in the woods, working for the Forest Service as a wilderness ranger and a trail crew foreman and a fire lookout, and doing every completely random job that you would have in a tourist ski town that you could imagine. So that was really fun, but eventually I went back to school and got a PhD at the University of Montana. And lo and behold, ended up getting a postdoc at the Desert Research Institute, which is also not a very typical place. So just a little bit about DRI. So we're part of the Nevada system of higher education, and organizationally we're on par with like the University of Nevada at Las Vegas or the University of Nevada at Reno. We are not a degree granting institution, and we're also 100% soft money funded. So we are a not-for-profit, state-owned institution. We're all state employees at DRI, but we are all 100% funded on soft money. And so that creates a really different set of incentives than traditional academic institutions. Tenure doesn't really exist at DRI. Either you have funding or you don't. And so that can be a pretty stressful situation. A lot of times we do have a lot of mechanisms and ways to kind of help people through rough patches, but essentially it tends to attract researchers that have a pretty high degree of what I think of as risk tolerance. And maybe tend to be a little bit, don't fit in the typical academic peg, so to speak, in a whole your variety of different ways sometimes. But what it does offer is a lot of opportunities to do things differently because our incentives are different for promotion, and or there's the opportunity for them to be different, and there's also fewer barriers to doing things differently because tenure doesn't exist. So I started as a postdoc in 2011 and have since then risen to the equivalent of what most people would consider a full professor. There are very few female faculty at DRI that hold that rank. And when I started in 2011, I was also the only social scientist in a sea of physical scientists. So as I like to put it, I was a cohort of one. And that also presented a lot of challenges, but it also gave me a lot of opportunities as well. And I don't like to discount either the challenges or the opportunities that presented. And over the time, I worked in a really unique group, the Climate Center group at DRI, for this entire time. And that was a group that was heavily influenced by not just the Regional Climate Center program, but also the NOAA's Regional Integrated Science and Assessments program, or RISA, or now how they're more currently about to be known as CAP, the Climate Adaptation Partnerships. And those teams have always really focused more on the integration of social and physical science, and also more what I would call research to operations or research to action. And so that gave me, even though I was a cohort of one, it gave me a great opportunity to tie into that entire RISA network, which was really, really important to me. I think, and one of the things that's really key to my success was having that broader network to both mentor me, people like Lisa Dilling, Maria Carmen Lemos, some of those really senior RISA PIs that were just one step ahead of me were very, very influential. And then currently, I kind of work as mostly as a co-lead or a lead for various long-running programs, including the California-Nevada Adaptation Program, which is part of the RISA network, and then also the Deputy Director for the Western Regional Climate Center. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor about some of the projects that I have been working on recently, I spend most of my time doing a lot of management stuff these days, but still have a few projects. And just to give you a sense of what those, some of the challenges and why I think that they've worked particularly well, and maybe places where they haven't worked. But the first is we call it the Red Flag Warnings and Fire Weather Watches Program. And so this is taking a look at a National Weather Service product, and it's a very integrated physical social science project. The main point of the project was to develop a new methodology for the issuance of basically these are wildfire products, of red flag warnings or fire weather watches. The social science part of the project was really trying to understand how these products were used within the fire management community. There were definite perspectives from the National Weather Service operational side about how they were used, but we were getting lots of indications that they were used often very differently than from the fire practitioner side than they were from the National Weather Service side. So we did a survey a couple of years ago, and we were particularly interested if there were differences in how these products were used based on the severity of the forecasted event. And, one of the key findings from this was really that they're not used differently based on the timing of the event. That didn't make a whole lot of sense. So fire weather watches are issued farther in advance, and red flag warnings are issued closer to the forecasted event. So the only difference is the timing of the issuance, not the severity. But we wanted to know if these, because we were proposing potentially to suggest a tiered product. And so we wanted to know if people use these things differently based on the severity and not on the timing. And you can see here that actually that is the case. that based on the severity, people do tend to do an extra set of management decisions. And so that was really helpful information for the National Weather Service, and has been wrapped up in a set of probably about 15 to 20 recommendations, including a methodology to evaluate the issuance criteria that's based on percentiles. But anyway, that's a big old project, but it gives you a sense of the kind of different things that we do and how we really try to do physical and social science. The second isn't so much a project, is an outreach and engagement component that I work on through CNAP that involves several key partners, including NIDIS, the Nevada Division of Water Resources, and the State Climate Office in Nevada. And we just recently used this scenario to kind of start building a conversation around drought impacts in Nevada and what that might look like in the future. Just some quick reflections on this. All of this work over the last, almost 12 years now, 11 and a half years, is that you can see from my wee doggy here that it is exceptionally messy work. It's not neat, it's not tidy, it's often really frustrating, and things come up in these integrated projects and actually trying to do decision support research that you never had any idea, even remotely, and completely blow your research plan out of the water. There's often epic levels of failure, and you have to be pretty willing to take that risk and to have that type of risk tolerance. The only way we get any of this work done is with our partnerships with practitioners, whether those are state agencies, not-for-profit groups, community groups. Those long-term partnerships and those relationships are the only way anything gets done. It also requires academics, researchers have a healthy dose of humility and really be willing to value other types of knowledge and take a backseat and just listen, and realizing that science and your research outcomes aren't always driving force, but they can have an important role. Sitting with uncertainty means, I think, really not knowing if things are going to work out or not, and being willing to really just to see how that unfolds, and that kind of ties in directly to a need to feel uncomfortable a lot of the time, either uncomfortable that you're being asked to play the role of the expert, and you may have your own kind of imposter syndrome going on, and also uncomfortable that it may be confronting issues around colonialism and historic multi-generational racism, and really sitting with that being uncomfortable and just being okay with that it's uncomfortable and having to move forward.
Tamara, you have 30 seconds more.
I know, I'm watching my watch here. I guess the last thing I would like to make, the comment I would like to make is that I'm not convinced that we're going to be able to do this work inside of traditional academic institutions. I think there's a lot of barriers, and I don't see those barriers changing very quickly, and that's of great concern to me. And it may be time to start thinking about new structures for research to action that have the ability to promote this work more actively and more quickly to get it on the ground. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Tamara. And I see we're getting questions in the chat. Please keep entering them, and we will address them at the end in a panel conversation. Next up is Miguel.
Right, let me share my screen. Okay, here we go. All right. Great. I hope everyone can hear me. If not, protest. I'm very happy to be here. It's a first time for me also to join the Science and Society section. I'm very excited to talk a bit about the kind of research that I do. What I want to get across today is just someone who works on the history and philosophy of science, why looking at science from a historical lens, looking at the current outputs and practices of science, but looking at how they developed over longer periods of time, going back to the history in the archive, is actually beneficial to geophysics or geoscience as it is practiced today. And I'll give you sort of two kinds of examples for why that could be beneficial. One is that looking back in history, we discover that many of the items of scientific knowledge that are most taken for granted today actually involved a lot of work and were really hard to establish. The slide I gave you here is the first model of the Earth figure and surface gravity variation in the history of the earth sciences, something that is used in almost, in Newton's, Isaac Newton's Principia. It's used in almost every task in the geosciences involving geolocation data. Nonetheless, although this research started in the 1687, it took until the turn to the 20th century for us to get any consistent measurements of the parameters of the Earth figure. So that's a research program lasting about 250 years. It's incredibly difficult. A lot of work was invested in it and involved significant methodological challenges. It's part of my work to study the history of the developments of models and measurements of the Earth figure and gravity field. And, I've published, and I have the idea that there's actually a lot of insights in this work, and the difficulties involved that are really relevant for current geoscientific practice. They can involve learning about mathematical techniques, derivations, the development of new mathematical tools, or they can involve, developing new methods for empirical work, for measurement and data collection. But there's another important part of another important kind of lessons we can draw from going and looking at the history of modern geoscience, and that's more of a moral and a political lesson. Much of the research traditionally done in geosciences, much of the data collection was done in incredibly unjust institutional structures, involving significant degrees of exploitation at a systematic and massive scale. What you see here is the 1920 state of what was by then one of the three largest geoscientific research projects in the history of science. It's the Survey of India, one of the prime sources in the 19th and 20th century of magnetic data about the Earth's magnetic field, geodetic data about the Earth's gravity field, tidal observations, and so on and so forth, astronomical observations, involved thousands of people, massive amounts of exploited and forced labor, as well as, often hidden contributions by brilliant scientists outside of the classical canon of the history of science in Europe and the US. And again, what we can learn from looking at this material and taking it seriously as part of something that is worthy of scientific considerations is, when scientific institutions work and in which cases they don't work, both in terms of moral functioning and epistemic functioning in the kinds of knowledge that they produce. So I think taking really serious all the ways in which scientific institutions didn't work in the way that we would want them to work in the past can teach us about how we can build inclusive and fair scientific institutions today. And it can help us to, communicate a vision of what science is that includes the contributions by figures that usually are not part of our canon, and that can make science a more attractive field. Science, the geoscience, is a more attractive field for people outside from Europe and the United States. So these are the two lessons I want to leave you with for why looking at history can actually be really insightful for our current scientific work in the geosciences. If you want more information, feel free to visit my website or reach out to me via email. It's very nice to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mikhail. And next up, we have Uruj Raja.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Uruj. First, I just want to thank Kripa, Aparna, and Julie for having a space such as this to talk about these issues. I think that the disciplines can learn more from each other, so it's really nice to be part of a space like this. So I'm going to keep it brief as well. So just a brief, quick agenda here. So a little bit about me, the thread that ties my research together, and then I was asked to talk about social psychology, sociology's contribution to the environmental sciences, and with some thoughts on that, and then some projects in development, and then a final call to keep the conversation going. So because we are a scholarly community, I just thought to give a little bit of a scholarly story of myself. So I was very interested in questions of history. So my background is in history, in sociology, and then environmental studies and science. So it's like my research, my sort of training is also very interdisciplinary. And I think that's by by design, because I'm very interested in looking at questions that straddle disciplines and that really are focused on the problem, and then drawing from the diversity of disciplines that are just in existence. So the thread that ties my research together is really a focus on the human factor, the key questions I strive to ask, whether it's a historical inquiry, whether it's a sociological inquiry, or more recently, if it's an inquiry based on social psychological logics, is really what is the human response to the problems that we are currently facing, and what are some lessons that we can learn and then apply to really shift the dimensions of the problem. So that's the main thread that ties my research together. Currently, I am really focused on social psychology, and the three areas I think that bring value or contribute to environmental sciences is the cognitive, affective, and behavioral aspects of social psychology. And then I think from sociology, it's really this focus on social systems, justice, inequality. We're increasingly seeing these things come to the surface of the boiling pot, which is America. So let me just kind of briefly define these terms. Cognitive, what I mean is really, what are the beliefs? What are the attitudes? What's going on in the mind? How are the wheels of the mind turning on some of the key things that are contributing or that could potentially address, let's say, climate change? And then folks in this tradition might be involved in the design of technologies, for example, that can reduce energy consumption. They might be looking at beliefs about greenhouse gas consumer decisions. They might be looking at adopting of solar to heating and cooling to electrical vehicle adaptation. Affective, which I think is less discussed in social psych, is more about the emotion, right? We know that rational, even though in the econ, I hope there's no econ folks in the room, it's almost suggested that we are rational creatures. It's also understood that we're very emotional creatures as well. So how do people make decisions based on affect? And then the behavioral dimension, which is very in line with all of these three dimensions, right? If social psychology is a pie, then all of these are slices. The behavioral aspect is really the performance part. What is it that makes someone take a belief and then perform it into an action? And so all of these things, I think we can really learn from, draw from, and learn specifically how we can use these specific pillars to address some of the things that we're seeing, particularly in regards to climate change. And then the last thing I do want to say on the affective dimension is we understand that climate change is such an unprecedented threat to human life, that it is causing some mental health effects on the population. And so psychology there can maybe help us understand some of these mental health responses to climate change and help people build psychological and really social resistance, resilience to better deal with climate impacts. And then social systems, justice, inequality, these are things that, we are dealing with on a daily basis. So how to use some of those traditions to understand that. And then lastly, some of the current projects that I'm specifically looking for that, in flux, draw richly from these disciplines. One project I'm looking at is looking at the most highly engaged Americans on climate change. What are the life stories? What are the factors that led them to those career trajectories, and seeing if we could replicate that. And then really climate messaging to diminish apathy. We know that othering in climate communication is a huge issue, why people sometimes don't react or respond to climate behaviors. So are there strategic and logical ways where we can overcome and diminish apathy and actually get more action on climate change? And then lastly is looking at the role of emerging technologies and engagement on climate change, and currently I'm doing a deep study of virtual reality, augmented reality, and Apple Watches. So these are just some projects in the work. Couple of last comments here. Let's continue the conversation. I think we need more spaces like this, as I've said, and it's one of the things I will say that it is really, really important for disciplines to learn from each other, because climate change is so huge. We just need all types of knowledge, all types of investment into this problem. And then last thing, if you have not already, vote, please.
Thank you, Uruj. And last but not least, we have Tushara.
All right, can y'all see the slides okay? Great. So I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the ways that we've been partnering with social sciences within the energy and water domains. So just a little bit of background. So similar to Uruj and Tamara, pretty nonlinear interdisciplinary path. So I was born and raised, spent half my childhood in South India, spent my formative years, high school and middle school in Northern Virginia, went to the University of Virginia for my undergraduate degree, took a little break and worked as an environmental consultant in Texas, and went back for my PhD at Vanderbilt. So some of the other words that you'll see on the screen are just terminology that has been applied to me as part of my identity over the course of my professional career. And one thing I want to highlight is across all of these different meandering pathways that I probably identify myself mostly as a complex systems analyst with a passion for water. And by this, I mean just really trying to understand the dynamics between the natural system and the human system and all the interesting interactions we have between them. So I have a few images here that kind of just step through a sampling of some of the projects we have been working on over the last few years. And at a high level, the methodologies that we draw on from the social sciences are really diverse. And by that, I mean that we work on everything from using semi-structured interviews to natural language processing and modeling and simulation approaches from agent-based modeling as well as system dynamics modeling. And we've also done work such as games in the field to try to gain insights. So across all of these methodologies, one of the things that we're really trying to be mindful of is what is the problem at hand? So just a few case studies of projects. So one, for example, we use semi-structured interviews to try to understand how are water constraints impacting energy production in coal-fired power plants? Because we recognize that while many coal-fired power plants use water for offsetting heating and cooling needs, really that waste heat issues, at the end of the day, each of them are in a specific geography and a specific social context regarding water. So the visual on the right kind of captures some of the ways that we try to distill some of the nuances with regards to how water constraints were being dealt by local plant operators. So another project we looked at was really focused on trying to understand narratives within text. So we've done this from everything from newspaper articles, trying to understand narratives around water and society at large, to really diving in specifically to maintenance records that were impacting the way that photovoltaic or PV system operators were being challenged for trying to understand what are the common failure modes that they're observing. Because you can imagine, especially with the interest towards moving towards a carbon neutral or carbon negative future, we really need to make our current renewable energy systems as resilient as possible. So doing our best to gain insight into what are common failure modes, it can be really powerful, but how do you do that with the existing messy data sets? And then the last project was more focused on trying to understand what are potential barriers to adopting new technologies. And for this, we were really curious about what were the individual drivers, but also what is the larger network structure that might be present within an organization, and how does that knowledge diffusion from management to different levels of staff potentially impact the way that people are either open to trying new technologies or less willing to try new technologies. So that's, looking specifically at research methods. I just want to briefly mention that our team really leans on social sciences based insights for how we execute projects. And this spans from everything from gaining clarity about what is the problem at hand and are we using the right tools to address that problem, to really streamlining communication so that we are ensuring that certainly the project team itself, but also the customers and other stakeholders are really understanding project priorities and nuances and everyone is on board. And then finally, from a cultural standpoint, as y'all might be aware of it in your own circles, right? We are moving at a lightning pace nowadays with new information, new staff coming on board at different times of projects. And we're really trying to be mindful of opportunities to improve community building through clarity and communication and other practices, and really help develop that culture of inclusivity and diversity as we move forward in the execution of the actual work. So my last slide here is just my contact information. So I'm happy to share additional information about these projects, as well as have discussions offline if it's of interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Thashara. And wherever you are, just join me in giving a little virtual round of applause for all of our panelists. We really appreciate their time today. And I'm going to turn it over to Kripa to kick off our panel.
Thank you so much, Tamara, Miguel, Arooj, and Thashara. That was phenomenal. As somebody who has, been trying to see if we can very quickly bring in everyone's perspectives, and there's just so many. It's been absolutely wonderful. I really took away a few things. I'm going to summarize that. Tamara, I really took away the messy and the risk tolerant nature of this work, which, you really so beautifully brought up, and also how where in our society do we promote this messy, uncertain, uncomfortable, risky work. And then Miguel, I really appreciate, I was very enlightened on this fact that a lot of the data we work with today are built on institutions that weren't just, and processes and approaches that weren't just. So how do we move forward as a society from here, where every model and data we have is built on these practices that we want to change? Arooj, why don't we center humans as an emotional being while we're doing the geosciences? Absolutely, all of us are emotional, cognitive, effective beings who have behaviors and a culture and are parts of social systems. How do we bring those in? And Thashara, you just brought us back to saying, how do we as engineers know what, or data scientists or geoscientists know what the problem is, and the problem is really on the ground. So really appreciated that. And it's a very small snapshot of what I heard, but I wanted to just say thank you very much for doing that. With that, and no pressure at all, with this question, I'm going to start with a tougher question for the panel, which is one that we wanted to ask you. And I would ask the audience as well to put in not just your questions, but answers to, if you have any thoughts or reflections to any of the questions. It's not just the panelists we want to hear from, we want to hear from you, and we would collect all of the chat. So the question is, and I think it goes to also David Bihar's question on the chat, which is, Tamara, you said you don't think traditional academic institutions are well set to support this kind of work, and we can today see why. It is not really necessarily part of the incentive structures and how we're built. What other sort of systems do you think would be these systems where we can thrive? What are the alternative structures? And specifically, we as a professional society, Science and Society New section, want all of your thoughts on how you think we can do better. What are these structures? What do we want to hear and learn more? And how do we as alternative a place build these structures?
I think it's, I think that the DRI model has real challenges. And it's not the total solution, but I think that there's elements there that could be, there's good things too. And so to me, it's almost like it's something in between a traditional academic institution and the model that DRI has, or taking maybe the best from both of those models. What DRI really suffers from is that we have what we call no hard money. And so that can create quite a bit of stress. And, we often have people leave who are really great researchers and we love having them, but it's too stressful for them. And also, if our model doesn't really promote, the kind of cohesive groups that the Climate Center group has become over time. And, DRI as an institution, I think, really struggles with how do they replicate that group within our current structure. And I think the big barrier there is that other entities at DRI don't have that. It's soft funding, but it's really long-term funding through like the Regional Climate Center program and the CAP/RESA program. And so for federal entities to create those long duration or the potential for those long running programs, I mean, CNAP is in its 5th iteration, its 5th award period, which means we're starting, I think we're at, Julie Kalansky and I were talking about this morning, like 25 years, you know, and that's just given us a huge opportunity to develop relationships across California and Nevada that are really important to us and enable us to do that work. And so I think there's some kind of hybrid or taking the best from these different models and incorporating it into something new. And that would maybe require, you know, a joint ventures between the federal, to some degree, the federal government and academia, and you know, public, I guess you call it public-private partnerships.
Thanks, Tamara. I want to go to Uruj and Tushara for this question for a university and a national lab perspective. How easy or tough has it been to do some of this work for you within your institutions, and how does Tamara's recommendations on alternative structures how do you feel about those? Are there any other things? And then after that, I'll go to Miguel as an early career scholar with even more funding issues on your perspectives on what makes sense. How can we promote this work? Uruj, maybe do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure, Kripa. You have us in a bit of a hot seat because this is recorded. So, you know, the last thing I would want is the president of the university go like, oh, one of our junior faculty members was saying that we're not particularly supportive. Luckily, it's not the case. My university, it's a Jesuit university, so they're really into the model of social change and, you know, being engaged citizens. So I'm really lucky, actually. Like I remember Miguel or anyone else who's currently on the job market of really being in a hard place, because a lot of the work I wanted to do, there was not really an academic home for it. It was more kind of theorizing. Critical inquiry was not really something that I was seeing a lot of in job announcements when I was on the job market. But I think that the hugeness of climate change, people understand that this is something that needs to be addressed. Like even in my title, there's advocacy, and usually scholars, especially some of us who've been trained in the positivist tradition, we see that word advocacy and it's like red flags, right? Stay away from that. It might not necessarily be objective. Is it rigorous, the research I'm doing? And the great thing is that I think institutions like mine and scholars, particularly who are straddling institutions and going from public-private, are getting better at showing that more creative forms of knowledge are rigorous and do have legitimacy, and they should be acknowledged. So I think that the advice I would give is just try to find an institution. But, you know, obviously, I run up to some constraints. Like I still need to produce scholarship. I need to produce in certain journals. I need to attend certain conferences. But I do think that 5 years ago or even 10 years ago, it's gotten better. And I'm hoping that things will get better as we go forward.
A sliver of a change, and some institutions which promote these a little better than others. Tushara, do you have something to add on that? Do you also see a little bit of a shift in some of these more traditional organizations as well?
Absolutely. I mean, so I can only speak on behalf of the current institution I'm in, which is an engineering lab. And I think one of the strengths that we have is that at the end of the day, we are here as a service to the nation, right? To support national security and global security priorities. So to that end, we have a fair bit of agency, I would say, with regards to the methods we bring together to ensure that the solutions or the problems that we're working on are taking advantage of the best science. So to that end, we have colleagues here at the national labs that specialize in human factors and applied cognitive science-based methods. But one thing I will highlight is, regardless of which institution you're in, one of the challenges that Tamara pointed to is that messiness. Interdisciplinary teams always have challenges with regards to how we effectively communicate with each other, how we effectively come together to develop solutions that meet the customer or the specific challenges at hand. And that is something that I think, whether you're in academia or a national lab, or even in the private sector, or more in the government sector, those will certainly come through. So I just saw, Julie's message come about what is some advice for moving forward at the intersection of science and society. And I think one of the things that I'm still, trying to figure out how I can best contribute in this space, but I think distinguishing that the institution that we're in, that is part of society. And wherever we are doing science. It might have different flavors and different things that we're emphasizing, but really being mindful of, we're all part of that complex system. We all have a role in this space, I think helps kind of clarify how we can best support, at least how I can best support as an employee at a national lab.
Thanks so much, Tushara. Even with the change, we really coming up on the best approaches is still a challenge that hopefully societies and conversations like these can help plug. Miguel, what from an early career person's perspective, what is good about this work? Why did you decide to do this work outside of the traditional realms? And what do you think can support, what structures can support people like you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a kind of unique place because I'm in a department doing history and philosophy of science. So in a way, we are trained with the assumption that you're kind of at the edge of at least three fields, one being historical work, and the technique is you need to learn to deal with the archive to potentially do quantitative work, and philosophical work, which means formal training, and scientific work, depending on the kind of issues that you'll be studying. So I mean, I suppose my personal reflection is that the biggest challenge that I face is that there's individual departments and individual institutions that offer that kind of training, but the larger funding structures in the job market obviously don't move as fast as the teaching institutions. So there's kind of a bit of a disconnect in when you are trained in a interdisciplinary manner, but you'll have to apply for jobs teaching and like researching in a much more narrow field. So that doesn't mean that necessarily this is a hindrance. That also makes you in some ways a more interesting candidate on the job market, at least in the fields that I'm in. But it does mean that it requires special training, right? So we should expect, I think, programs that aim to foster that kind of training, also to offer training how to navigate the job market given the unique non-standard way that you're being educated. I mean, that's the little perspective that I have on that issue in my few years in the academy, but I hope that is helpful.
No, that is very powerful. How do we as institutions, as we make slow change, also ensure this growth is faster and people like you who are in the job market have better opportunities? For the next question, I think Aparna is going to handle.
Thanks, Kripa. I'm going to combine a couple of questions that came into the chat with my own sort of observation that there was a common thread, I think, through your 4 talks of acknowledging inequity in sort of past practices and sort of the societal and institutional constructs that have resulted out of that inequity. And there was an acknowledgement that we need to improve our current practices and perhaps even repair past harms that have occurred. So I'm going to kick it to Miguel first, and maybe we can go in somewhat reverse order this time. But I was hoping that each of you might be able to share some thoughts on, as Kripa put it, how we as a modern quote unquote society move forward from some of those historical inequities and how we might be able to implement improved practices going forward.
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. If I would have had if I had 10 minutes to speak, I would have talked about that. So I think it's really important to distinguish sort of two horns of that question. One being, how can we do that as a society? And then one question that was posed by Raj in the chat is, what can we do as individual scientists or researchers? Because I think these are different questions. Some of the issues like the ones that I touched on about just, global asymmetry in how data is produced and who is actually, gaining accreditation and who's producing, marketable scientific results from that data. are just, reflective of inequities or inequalities in the global distribution of resources and political power. And that's nothing that as individual scientists or scientific societies we are able to deal with. But I do think there is a lot of things that we can do. And I'll just, I'm reflecting on that from my particular vantage point. I think, looking at the history of data collection can teach us at least two things. On the one hand side, we can just look at what went wrong in the way that institutions functioned. And I think accreditation is an important point. Like we can see who was involved to what degree in the production of a scientific result. You can go to the archive and actually reconstruct it in many cases. And we can make a moral judgment about if that is a just distribution of accreditation or not. And we can understand the processes that lead to an unjust distribution of accreditation and can look at current institutions, see if they match them. The second perspective is about continuity, right? Many of the imbalances that you find in the material that I'm studying of power and accreditation across countries and across institutions are not a separate issue we can study and learn from, but they're continuous to the institutions that we're in today. So I think, it's still a huge problem if you look at citation ranks and the distribution of citation across different countries in the global north and the global south. These asymmetries continue in our institutions that we're in. And a huge thing we can already do is just making networking events and conferences more accessible. We can move more events like this online. I think this removes a lot of visa and travel barriers. And we can, think about where do we recruit people to join events, which kinds of institutions I want to cooperate with, which email list will I enter, in these kinds of little questions. I do think that can make a difference that is historically informed as well.
Thank you, Miguel. And I think that's such a great point to separate what we as individuals might be able to have in our span of control versus what is a larger societal challenge that maybe we can be part of addressing that solution, or as HEU is a global international organization, we may have other levers that we can push. Bashara, do you want to chime in from your experiences?
Oh, I don't know if I have an answer here, but it is certainly something that's been on our mind a lot of late, especially because, and I completely support, Miguel, your points about, taking things virtual and being mindful of that. But I also recognize that we all, for example, with the AGU fall meeting, right, we had times in sessions that were not necessarily conducive to everyone, right? So I think there is hard questions that we have to ask ourselves when we talk about how inclusive do we make this, but also do it in such a way that we're promoting our primary objectives. Because sometimes I think trying to make everything inclusive, we can run the risk of being overly informative or spamming people a lot. And one of the things that at least I struggle with in my day-to-day life is how do I stay on top of things and make meaningful contribution versus just get inundated with emails and updates day in and day out, right? Especially as we try to also have this mythical, work-life balance that we're all striving for. So long story short, I don't know if I have anything concrete to offer, but just that I think creating spaces like this to have meaningful conversations and where we're able to really be clear about these are our values and here are the options that are potentially on the table and how do we make those hard decisions about which of the options do we move forward with based on our alignment with our values. I think at the end of the day, that's one thing that I'm trying to work better on. But
thanks, Bashara. I think that is definitely a hard reality that we're all struggling with, the trade-offs involved in each of these decisions and how they can be wins or gains for some and harms or losses for others. So I think that is definitely a challenge that we have confronted during the pandemic, and we're going to continue to be confronting going forward. Uruj, do you want to take a stab at answering this question?
No, I think the previous two speakers did a good job, so I'll stop it there.
Okay, thanks. And Tamara, do you want to chime in? And if not answering this question, I know in the chat you were addressing a little bit of tribal engagement, and that's also, I think, fair game to talk about here.
all I would add is that it's easy to put our colleagues, our Indigenous colleagues, are into spaces where it's performative and checking a box, and ensuring that they feel that they have the ability to say no is always really, really important. And my colleague Amber Paris at the Climate Science and Alliance brought that up yesterday in a meeting that we were having. And also there's a real challenge for organizations that even want to do the quote unquote the right thing, to really challenge their assumptions on how they organize and run things and create space or don't create space, particularly for our Indigenous partners, to really be able to show up with what somebody referred to yesterday as their entire self, and their entire Indigenous self. And that is really often, again, going back, it can be very uncomfortable, but it's work that needs to be done if we're going to make progress and really not have this be performative and basically useless.
Thanks so much, Tamra. Aparna, since we have 3 minutes, can I ask for concluding remarks on our last question? Thanks. So we do have the space that Julie and Kevin and so many others in the Science to Action Network have created after many years of hard work. So we do have a Science and Society section. We were wondering if people can chime in on chat. What is the unique niche of this Science Society section? And our panelists, with their last thoughts, how can we carry forward these conversations? Do you have topics for future dialogues, or other, should we have a few people from other professional societies here today. Thank you so much for joining us. Like, how do we build this network? And specifically, I wanted to say it right at the end that we wanted a free platform for people to join us and know about the section, because the fall meeting does tend to be a little bit expensive for everyone. So we're open to ideas. If folks want to brainstorm ideas, do direct message me and Aparna with your email ID, and we'll contact you. But your last thoughts on what is this unique niche we have, and how can we carry forward these conversations? And maybe Uruj, Tushara, Miguel, and Tamra to 30 seconds each.
Yeah, I mean, I think the research is pretty clear. Gatekeepers play a huge role. So I think even the agenda that AGU Science and Society is setting is really, really important. So just more, I guess, more initiatives that are similar to this. I would just add one more thing, maybe thinking about windows of opportunity. So particular events, or like right now, a lot is going on with the climate conference. We have election day right here. So just kind of harnessing those windows of opportunity and maybe having events around that.
Absolutely. Take charge of the times. Tushara?
Yeah, great ideas, Uruj. One thing I would add is, especially as, we're all students in life, right? Regardless of where we are in our career, but creating opportunities that kind of go back to where the communities live or where the academic programs exist, right? Because I've been in situations where engineers don't get exposed to this kind of work as part of their basic curricula. So finding ways to go back to these home programs, I think, could be a way to broaden the awareness, just because the interest is there. It's just a matter of awareness of these kinds of spaces exist. Could be a nice resource to tap into.
Grab windows of opportunity, go back to the community. Miguel?
Right. I mean, I think I want to, my concluding statement, model it a bit on what Tushara has said as a follow-up to me before on performative versus, and Tamara said as well, performative versus putting in the actual work, right? I think that's a crucial point. I mean, speaking as a sort of someone interested in history, I think we know there's lots of talk about injustice and inequity. We have to put in the work to actually understand, for specific communities we're working with, specific cases, what has historically created the perception of injustice and inequity that we're dealing with here. We have to understand the mechanisms, how our societies have engaged with other people in an unjust way in the past to tackle this. So it's a lot about putting in the work to gain this information of how we got where we are.
Put in the time to reflect. And Tamara, do you want to close us off as people start leaving?
I would just say that the call that academia begins to recognize that there are many different types of knowledges, including in sciences, including Indigenous science, and it's time to take a bigger view about how to include those different knowledges, including lived experiences, as we confront climate change and those impacts.
How do we expand our knowledge base effectively? Thank you all. It was really nice, and we hope to see you at the AGU fall meeting and hopefully find some way to continue these conversations. And thank you so much to our panelists.
And thank you to the moderators.